Hello, everyone. And up for our next session is the myth of fit, managing new leader risk. We have Stephanie Henderson, practice leader, and Linda Reese, managing partner. And now I will take it over to Linda to lead our discussion for the day.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, but also sad that I'm not here with everybody in person. I wanted to give you just a quick overview of me and our work. I'm an IO psychologist, industrial and organizational psychologist by training. I'm joined today by my valued colleague, Stephanie Henderson. She's going to be behind the scenes, but is going to be helping with polling and Q&A, and her contribution is present in all the slides that you'll see. We've actually spent our entire careers doing this kind of onboarding work, and we're still fascinated by it, which says there must be something to it. And I wanted to just make a quick side note mention to you that we've been interested in high growth firms for quite a while. And we've actually done some real world research with client organizations that are either in high growth mode or wish to be. And one of the things that was differentiator for the successful high growth firms was that they had very strong operational leaders. So think finance, sales, IT, and that their capabilities matter more than in other kinds of companies. So we think it's especially appropriate that we're here today to talk with you. There's two quick housekeeping items. We encourage you to share your questions throughout the presentation by messaging them, and then we'll get back to them at the end of the presentation. I also just wanted to mention it's a lot of words to say onboarding new leaders or new leader hire or whatever. So I'm just going to say new hire throughout the presentation, and you can assume that we're talking about a leadership population. We have always loved working with technology and with scientists. We've learned a lot over the years. And I think one of the things we've learned first and foremost is that leader hires are high impact for these groups of people, especially when they're in growth mode. The future really hinges on who gets hired. And the company and the people in it are usually moving pretty fast. And so the transition is really important because these new leaders have to perform quickly, but they have to do it right. And that's really where the crux of the problem is when it comes to onboarding, which is leaders who try to contribute too quickly or in a way that's not helpful run the risk of derailing. And they may not be aware of how much they have to learn about the organization, their deliverables, before they can really perform 100%. So while we think the solution is simple, it's really not easy. And that is that these leaders need to start out going slow to go fast, and we need to support them in that. I'd like to take a minute just to talk about onboarding as a word, as a verb in particular, because some organizations talk about onboarding as orientation. But our definition is really from the time we're interviewing candidates to the time that a leader is at least 80% proficiency in their job. And that usually takes 4 to 6 months. I think when we talk about the myth of fit, what we're really saying is that we typically are told if someone's successful that we've made a great hire. And if they're not successful, that we've made a bad hire. But in our work, we see great hires fail all the time. And we find that the failure is rarely about the person who's been hired. It's much more about the transition. Although there are some bad hires, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. Failure is really painful. The derailment of a new leader is painful for everyone. It's painful for that person. It's painful for their hiring manager. It's painful for their team. And it's really costly. On a conservative end of the scale, we'd say that 2.5 times annual salary is about what it costs to replace a leader. And that doesn't really count undoing the damage. And on the high end of the scale, where this is a change agent or someone who's responsible for something big like a product launch, the cost can be millions. And that's only hard costs. That's what we can calculate. You know, we've all started new jobs, right? And I guess I'm really interested in knowing about your own experience. Who expected a great ramp up and was disappointed? You know, did you have a job that didn't go well, or did you do the hiring and that person didn't thrive? Or perhaps both. I suspect many of us have seen both those things. And who's lucky enough to have had neither of those things happen? We're going to take a minute now because we'd like to hear from you, and we're going to take a quick poll. There should be a red poll button at the center of the bottom of your screen, and Stephanie is going to take the polling from here.
So let us know what your experience has been. And we've got answers coming in right now. I'll give it a little bit longer. So it's looking interesting. We've got bad experiences, both new hire and hiring manager. Some coming in, lots of them coming in as a new hire. Very small percentage as none. So
well, that feels good. That suggests maybe we're needed.
Yeah. So we're about evenly placed at I had a bad experience as a new hire, hovering around 40%. Only about 12% are saying just as a hiring manager. And then about 40% around bad experiences, both a new hire and a hiring manager. And then only about 7 or 8% as none of the above. So equally.
So I'm sure for the none of the above, the entire rest of the call are envious of you. I'd like to talk about what we want to talk about today. And thank you very much, Stephanie.
And Linda,
ahead,
let me pipe in and say one more. A comment came out that we've got a highly experienced CFO that has rarely had a good onboarding experience starting a new job. So there we go. That was an extra comment to the poll.
Well, and I'd just like to take a side note and say, the dirty little secret about leader transition is that it is messy. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. We're not really supposed to talk about what's going wrong when we start a new job. So what we're here to do today is to give you some concrete tools and knowledge that can help you navigate more effectively and feel better about your next transition, but also bring people on more gracefully, because it's a high stakes game and everybody has a stake in it. So, my goal today and our goal today is at the end of this conversation that you'll agree that new leader success is not about the who of what you hire, but that it's really about the how. And the buck stops with you and with us. What we have found that's interesting is that tech firms are big users of what we call onboarding technology, which is usually about streamlining paperwork, making sure that the first day checklist is in place. There's some gamification around learning and sometimes relationship building. But then the support ends at about a month. And we believe that's probably sufficient for individual contributors, but that it's not enough for leaders. Some bosses hand off a book, and sometimes those books are helpful, but sometimes they offer bad advice. And so what we would say is, if you're a hiring manager, what you want the new leader to do is be a humble learner. It is not about moi. It's not about how important I am or how I'm here to save the day if I'm new. It's about me being respectful and learning so that I can have the best impact possible. How to get better at this? That's really the big question. And I would say there's good news, which is we spent quite a few years applying science to leader onboarding, and we're going to talk some about the science today. And the spoiler alert about the science is that it probably won't be surprising now that we've talked, which is that having a good ramp up makes it likely that good things are going to happen for a new hire. And a bad ramp up means that things are going to be not quite as pleasant. But it is definitely a lot more than who we hire or what they know or where they come from. We really believe onboarding does start with the hire and perhaps even during the selection process. And I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying this, but science does say that we're pretty terrible at picking the right employees. So just the typical selection process, that new employee has only about a 10% chance of doing better than anybody that might have been picked by random in the candidate pool. And if you have a fabulous process, that person may have a 50% better chance, but we really can't guarantee anything. The thing to know about hiring is that it's how we want to make the unknowns known. There are things we can definitely learn through the candidate's selection process about them, their background, their skills, what they're interested in. But there's far more unknowns that remain, even with a good process. And the things we don't know, the unknown unknowns, are the things that hugely impact success. If things don't go well, if we haven't found something that's important to know, it creates anxiety for the new hire, and it definitely creates anxiety for their boss and probably for their team. And so what we would say is we need to get better, and we need to get better upstream in the hiring process, but we also need to use science to make as many unknown unknowns known as possible. And that's really just risk management. And that's how we think of our work, is we all want better hires and we want better odds for the hires we have. There is a lot we can do about it. And the first thing we can do is really lean into the unknown. We do that by expecting and embracing risk, knowing what those risk factors are and tackling them head on. And what we know from our work is that every new hire faces risks in their transition, but those risks are all different per new hire. And that's why it's really important to be thoughtful about this. The other thing is that I find sort of amusing is that we all like to think we're highly evolved and that, we use a lot of rationality at work and in making decisions. But science has told us really we're pretty much nothing more than naked apes. We think we ignore emotions and focus on facts while we're at work, but there's a disproportionate impact of emotions on decisions and actions that we take, and we often fail to recognize those. So we thought we would take a different perspective on transition today to help you understand that we need to balance logic and emotion if we're going to be successful supporting our new hires. Now, every new hire is going to generate some kind of emotion in themselves and in other people. And it's great if it's a positive emotion. I'm sorry about that. But the problem is that there are far more negative emotions, and some of those emotions are just scary and things we don't talk about in the workplace. There's fear, there's anxiety. We found there's more jealousy than you would expect. And all those emotions are completely appropriate responses to the situation and the stimuli. But because they're not acceptable to express in the workplace, they tend to go underground and influence behavior in problematic ways. They signal risk, most of all, and that is a foolish thing if we ignore that risk when we know that it exists. The good news is that emotions don't have to ruin things. There's a lot we can do. We want to point out that tech leaders have some special kinds of risks, whether you're an engineer or you're a developer. And we have found that in the world of technology, direct reports of people who are new hires tend to value the hard skills, whatever they are, more than leadership skills or soft skills. And sometimes they're devaluing their boss because they think they're more expert at those hard skills than the boss is. We've seen people in open settings pressure test their bosses to see what they know as a way of sort of firing a shot across their bow, and then sometimes even behave worse than that. So, it's just a rule of thumb would be that being a calm, skilled leader gives you a lot of advantages, especially when you need to stay off your back foot if you're confronted by other people or put in an uncertain situation. One of the challenges we face with tech leaders is they tend to be elevated more quickly and therefore are less experienced and may have less leadership training. Sometimes when we lack experience, we lack coping skills for dealing with the unexpected. That can cause overreaction. And trust me, I've seen some really odd things in my career around this, but also it just exacerbates the problem. So if we could agree that the basic science is that emotions signal deeper concerns, then we know that there's something we can do about it. So success mode is, let's say someone who wanted the job didn't get it and they act out against their new boss. They're embarrassed and angry that they didn't get the job. Success mode for the new leader is to anticipate that there's almost always going to be someone that's unhappy that they're starting the job, to help them adjust, to help them feel valued, and to be calm, mature leaders. We're going to take a minute on a worksheet activity that we really can't do virtually, but it's a real life example. A blank version of this worksheet on the next screen is going to be available at the back of your presentation, as are the other worksheets that we use throughout this process. And you are welcome to use them as you see fit in your own work, including adapting them if that seems appropriate. What we have in this situation was we had a leader who had both positive and negative emotions about starting the job. The first one was the positive, and while that's usually good, he was too excited. And so he had a big new tech role. He was responsible for breakthrough R&D, and he had thousands of people reporting downstream in his organization. The challenge was that it was a really old school, troubled kind of company where being a nice person was more important than being good at what you do or saving the company. And so his excitement in that environment ended up meaning that he was offering too much too soon, and he was overwhelming his team with emotion. So what we did with him was we really tried to help him slow down, respect the people, set his own ego aside, focus on learning from others for a variety of reasons. And at that point, his enthusiasm about the job became motivating for his team and not a problem. He was also worried about his family because he was an expat. He came from a far, far away country, halfway around the world, and his family was left behind for months. Now, he did some things about that. He was in constant communication. He made sure that his wife and the kids landed in June, which, if it weren't the time of COVID, which would be the great time to meet the kids that they're going to school with in the fall through sports teams, belonging to a pool membership, something like that. What really helped this leader was he had a generous, enlightened company. They understand the risks that he was going to face. They connected him and his family with schools, sports teams, doctors, a recruiter for the spouse who was trailing, and they really helped them embed themselves in the community. The family felt really valued, and 10 years on, he's still in the role, he's thriving, and his family's thriving, and they've done some amazing work during this COVID time too, which hopefully you'll hear about in the media at some point in the future. One thing to note is a lot of times we don't talk about our personal situation at work. As a matter of fact, our British clients don't even see how it matters. But what we've found is that it's a cultural thing, by the way, no disrespect to the British, is that a poorly managed personal transition, whether it's angry teenagers or, the list is endless, is the number 2 reason that leaders who leave their jobs prematurely leave. So worth looking at. So remember that derailment happens and we pay a high cost. I want to do a quick exercise with you because it sounds like most of you have been impacted by transitions that have gone sideways. I'd like to ask you to think about a new hire, and that new hire could be you. And I'd like to ask you to listen to your emotions and identify what worries you about that transition. Maybe come up with a couple of things that worry you. I hope it won't scare you, but what we found in doing our research with our clients is there are about 20 things about the person and the job that are risk factors for transitions. And I'm sure if you were thinking about the transition that you're concerned about, that some of the risk factors that you identified are things that we look at too. What we'd say is when you're sizing up risk, if the leader has 5 or more risk factors combined, you should pay very close attention to their transition. That's a lot. Generally, the more risk factors they have, the more risk they face in ramping up in their role successfully. And also, the good news is the more attention you pay to that, the better the outcomes that they're going to get. So if you want to do something about this risk management, the best thing you can do is size up each transition separately, find the 3 biggest, scariest risk factors and handle those first, and stay committed to risk mitigation throughout their tenure. Next up, we want to talk about some things that we can do about identifying risk and then handling it. It's really important to look over the edge of the cliff and know what's down at the bottom or what could be, because that's how we're going to be the best resource for the people that we bring into new jobs. And so if you can be frank with yourself, not with the new leader necessarily, but with yourself, and say, what are the things that could go wrong? And what's the absolute worst that could happen in this situation? And really enumerate that list thoroughly. Then you can have a strategy of preventing or mitigating basically the impact of those risks, heading some off at the pass entirely, but dealing with others as they happen. And we think that is what the onboarding process is supposed to be focused on. Now, I know we've talked about emotions, and you may not be feeling the feelings when we talk about this approach. So logic certainly plays a role. Thinking about just from a calculated financial risk management perspective, understanding what's at stake can help us figure out next steps in addressing it. It's good to know that there are different kinds of risk, because I think that there's some that are leader dependent, like personality and leadership style, but there's a lot more that are about the role and about the company the leader is going to join. And some of those can be unrealistic expectations or the culture not being user-friendly. We'll talk more about those later. Take a look at these leader-centric and role-centric risk factors. I know most of you have had experience with struggling leaders, whether that was your hire or yourself. Did you see any of these things in play in those transitions? What we see is eager, driven leaders crashing ahead, jobs that are vastly different from what they were expected, and broken teams that weren't revealed to the new leaders. And we also found that new leaders everywhere face these risks. In tech firms, for sure, and everywhere else too, healthcare, financial services, all the market sectors. The fact that these risks are universal really means that it's a gift that we know it, and we should be figuring out what to do about it, because we can definitely make a difference. It will make the future better for many people. We're going to do another worksheet activity. And again, what we've done is pre-filled the worksheet, and I'm going to talk you through it a little bit. But it's, sizing up the risk factors is a high impact strategy to take when you're bringing a new person on board. It's also appropriate when you're elevating someone where you've got significant stretch in the role. We have one favorite client that completely leaned into risk, and it really took a village. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. She was a VP of product management, and she had many risk factors, and these risks were significant because she was responsible for launching new product. So to make a little sense of this worksheet, what I would say is that we're going to start with the left column. And in the first item in the left column, she had an angry teenager. I think that's probably happened to some of us. What she did about it was really focused on helping her child maintain those friendships, schedule visits, do things that would make the transition easier for them and help them be happier with the transition. Because again, we have seen leaders who have departed because they had an angry teenager. Just don't underestimate it. The second item, I think, is a really more complex one, and that is that the team was confused and they were low performing, but they believed that things were okay. No one had ever really given them feedback that they weren't performing well, and their industry was in crisis. So all of a sudden, they were expected to perform at an even higher level. Her boss told her that they weren't high performing. She was tempted to send that message to them, but she realized that if she was going to bring her team along, she really needed to take time to understand them. So there were some things that she did in the second column on the second line, trying to understand how she could avoid surprises and how she could talk to her boss about the things that weren't as expected. A third item on this worksheet is when an interim leader didn't get the job, and this was one of those most interesting things we've seen. It's really important, if someone wanted that job, that we look at the things in the second column that we can do about it. Taking concrete action, connecting them to important work, preparing them for possible promotion. Those are all things that the new leader engaged in and really made a difference in helping win over that spurned rival. The fourth is the trickiest of all. So in the left column on the fourth item, we mentioned that the boss's expectations exceeded the team's capacity. And really the team was broken. And that makes path forward really difficult to identify. So there was a lot of work that she needed to do with the new leader or with the hiring manager and with her team. She had to provide support. She had to be very patient, and she had to really focus on reconciling the gaps and know it was her job to do so, align the expectations for the team. Now, this risk management matters, and I just want to give you some more scary statistics, is that if you don't give any help at all to a leader who moves into a new role, they have a 40 to 60% chance of being gone or moved into a smaller role by the time they're in the job 18 months. Some of that's voluntary, some of that's not. It's always a problem. What we found in our work, which we found very encouraging, is that with the right kind of support, over 90% of the leaders that we've encountered have been successful, not only in sticking around, but in delivering needed results. Now, her boss helped create some of the problems that this leader faced. So part of this was about confronting the brutal facts without being brutal about it. He did recognize that he had not really painted an accurate picture of the role during selection. He took responsibility for that. For the first item, he was extremely generous in making resources available to the leader and her spouse and children. On the second item, where the widely varying definitions of what the job is, he admitted that even to him that the role wasn't clear and that he understood how he contributed to the fuzzy understanding. He focused in the right column on the second item in connecting the leader with other stakeholders, understanding the history between their areas and what they expected, and helping her misaligned expectations become aligned. The third item was about the context and the interim leader. And what the hiring manager did was he provided his new hire with context about the skill gap so she could guide that spurned rival in a way that was going to be friendly, supportive, and positive. And he really came around. It was very rewarding to see that. The fourth item is really about expectations. And again, this is the tricky part. We had to talk openly about the paradox of, the team having skill gaps, and that's actually going to require even more patience from the hiring manager and the new leader. This required, and the solutions in the right column, frequent conversations about performance expectations, the team, and really being patient enough to develop the team. That's what they did. Just to know that the risk factors that you see on the screen, they can show up. You can become aware of them before the hire, during the hiring process, or after the hire. There are some problems with the hiring process. We want to impress the candidate, so often we hide things that are unsavory about the role or pretty them up and try to paint maybe a positive picture to attract the best hire possible. That can create problems. And we think that really success mode is transparently tackling these items up front to start risk management. We've also found that will scare away the people who are not capable of handling the risks that they face in the job. So take a deep breath and take a risk on doing it. It's really a set of choices that every boss has to make. If you want your leader to be effective, if you want to build trust, you need to set them up for success. And understand that failing to do so is also a choice, but maybe an unfortunate one. As we discussed, every transition has risk. I hope you see some examples of how to improve the odds. Leaning into the risk management process takes time, thought, and energy. We really have to confront the brutal facts. We need to make a plan and support it. It needs to be unique for each new leader. We have to have a real commitment to this, but know that if you do that, it's always worth it, but especially for what we call strategic hires. And those are the people who have the most responsibility for making a difference in the business. We do think that the nature of work in growth stage tech companies increases risk for a variety of reasons. So first of all, things move very fast. Second of all, there is significant pressure on leaders to perform, and it's hockey stick performance. It is not typical, let's slowly grow the company. It is, we want to grow dramatically. And really, to be effective in a transition and in a growing company, you have to balance that need for speed with building the infrastructure to make performance possible. We've also found that virtual teams make it harder to build trust and understanding. Once it's established, it's a lot easier, to work together successfully. We've definitely seen the impact of the COVID crisis on this particular item. And leaders need to scale results, so they need all the support they can get. What we've seen in every success story we've ever experienced is 3 things. These 3 factors are critical. The first is, and most important, is relationships. They are how new hires get knowledge, they are how they get feedback from other people, and they are ultimately how they build the base for influence that they're going to have in the organization. It's also really important to focus on learning by including other people in your learning process and being humble about it. As a new leader, you can make better decisions and they will be better accepted, partly because they're more informed, but partly because they're inclusive. The biggest concern we have with new hires is often that feedback is absolutely essential for them, but it's very rare that it be delivered in a way that's helpful. People, especially people in the nice Midwest like we are, don't want to offend the new leader. They want to have a positive relationship, so they may fail to say something that could help that leader be more effective. But what we've learned is failing to share feedback means bad things happen, and most of those bad things are avoidable. In our work at Leader Onboarding, feedback really drives everything. We like to give our clients powerful information really early in the process, which is actually right when it's needed, before the window of judgment closes and while they still have time to make things better. We have a tool we developed that's basically a 360 tool for new leaders. It's called Level Set Early Feedback. It's backed by science. It predicts who's going to thrive in the role and who's likely to fail, and then we can chart our course accordingly. We've learned that if we focus on these 3 areas, it helps people understand the role better, we can choose the best approach to onboarding, and we improve their odds of success. So let's think back to that hire that made you uncomfortable, where you had some worries 15, 20 minutes ago. What's one thing, based on what we've talked about today, that you can do to help them? Would you take a minute to just write it down? And remember that you could be that hire, so it could be about what you want to do to help yourself. Okay, now that you have that, the next question, and perhaps the most important one, is when are you going to do it? Because that's what makes the difference, and it's really up to you to make sure that happens. If you want to create success for everyone in the equation, remember that the perfect fit is really a myth, that talented leaders, they fail every day. We can improve their odds significantly. Risk management is an essential part of that process, and it really takes a village to support an effective leader transition. We're inviting you to be part of that village and to be that for every new hire, not just the folks on your team, but to remember how complicated, tricky, and emotional these transitions can be and figure out how you can help the company by helping new people. I think we have just a few minutes for questions, so I would like to turn it back over to Stephanie and see what you've had come your way during the presentation.
So thanks, Linda. And what we have heard is early on, somebody asked, what is the definition of a bad hire experience? Usually executives are hired because there's something that needs to happen in a functional or any number of functional areas. So what does that look like when it's bad?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, let's just be frank and say leadership roles are not for the faint of heart. They are challenging, and we really like seeing people prepared throughout their career for increasing levels of complexity and challenge as they elevate. I think a bad hire is when the leader goes home from work and can't talk to their spouse about how terrible things are at work because their family's having a rough transition too. And we've actually found that catapulted one family back to their home city because the new leader was carrying the weight of all the worries in the transition. I do think a bad transition is a bad experience is an experience that a leader has alone or has without the support of a confidential conversation or a confidant. And so really, it's not as much about what happens. It's about how we anticipate it, how we respond to it, how we get support for it, and then how we make sense of it and determine if it all fits together in the way we need to perform in the job. I hope that's the answer you're looking for.
So interesting. One participant piped in and said, "Hey, I think it's about lack of communication, lack of a clear plan, and defining what success looks like." And so that brought up to me, can you talk a little bit about role clarity and the role that plays in a good transition?
Yeah, and actually, if there were only one thing that I could have you remember after this presentation, it would be this. We did applied research with leaders and found that the number one predictor of whether they could stay or whether they had to leave was the extent to which they established and were able to maintain role clarity. And we both sort of jokingly say that if you want to understand a leader's role, throw away the job description and start asking the people around the leader what they expect from them. And what we found is that, one finance leader may say, I expect them to deliver everything under budget. While, they're an R&D leader, their boss says, I need you to have breakthrough innovation. Well, are those things incompatible with each other? And if they're not, what do we have to do to meet in the middle? So to the extent that a leader can understand and align expectations to get role clarity, then they can fulfill their role by doing some of the things we've talked about, commit to the future. And if it's disjointed enough, if it's misaligned enough, often that's information that if it can't be resolved, causes leaders to leave. So just remember, role clarity is the number one predictor of success, and it takes a lot of work to understand what that is. And it's also an ongoing process. Mm-hmm. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah. So we've had a few more pop in. And so there is this one that asking what's a good way to provide KPIs for people in leadership roles, preferably in services spaces?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, obviously it flows from the organization's strategy, what you want to accomplish as a whole organization. We have one client we've worked with who's done a beautiful job of taking the higher level strategy, working it into strategic pillars. There's some cross-cut across the different functional areas, but then there's definitely deliverables. They have financial goals for themselves. They also have service level goals for themselves, and they establish those at an enterprise level and then figure out how each leader supports it. So I think if it cascades from the strategy, you have a better chance of choosing KPIs that are appropriate. We always want to stretch people in their jobs, but as an industrial psychologist, I'll also tell you, if you give them goals that they can't achieve, you're going to lose them. And while leaders will struggle mightily to make sure that they can do the best they can, their team will get left behind in the dust. So fantastic question. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah. So there's a comment and a question about changing onboarding programs during the pandemic, but let me bring you to the comment first, and then maybe we can get to the question about the pandemic. It says, it sounds like many new hire executives are somewhat naive about what is necessary to be successful in a new position. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, Linda.
I think they forget what the most important supports are. And again, not to disrespect any authors of books about transition, but those books actually give very detailed examples of how leaders can go out and sort of slay the dragon. And what we would say is it's really important to have a robust body of work and to understand the nuances of the role. What we find is that leaders have to bump out the time and make a space for them to have conversations so they can learn other people's perspectives, because they will get in trouble if they assume that their data points are correct and the only correct ones. The other thing is they'll win the support of other leaders when they do that. Now, seasoned leaders who've been around the block a few times, and sometimes you get that with, well, a lot of times you get that with senior executives, still have to put aside their preconceived ideas about what the right answer is, even if they scaled a company, last year. It may be different for your firm. So what we would say is look and think before you act. Be very intentional. Have a plan. Have a thought partner in your transition. Make sure you get what you need, but really think of feedback and the information that you're going to get as the oxygen you need to breathe in your role. Use your skills. You're definitely being hired to drive results, but temper that with a desire to make sure that the results can be sustained by the people that you're managing and others in the organization. Great comment, though. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Linda, for clarifying. And so this other question is, what do you suggest companies do to change their onboarding programs if they are hiring during the pandemic?
Well, I think if we go back and say onboarding is from selection to 4 to 6 months enroll, or really 80% proficiency, that's what we say is onboarded, I think broadly about onboarding because you're bringing a lot of individual contributors in as well as leaders. And this is where onboarding technology can be very useful to you. We have some favorites, including a firm called OnBoarding, which is based in the UK, but has a wonderful tool set. We would recommend investing in that so that you can serve your entire population in that way. But then when it comes to the leader who's transitioning into the role, the above and beyond would be really thinking carefully about how to help them feel at home in the company. Sometimes that's sending them stuff that they get delivered to their front door, whatever your swag is that you're going to send them, your tchotchkes. But it's also making sure that they're completely set up with all the tools they need to work remotely, that you've got a great way of engaging them with the people in the organization, that everybody knows that this person's coming and that they're expected to make some time, giving them a lay of the land. And that's what the new leader should be doing, is really learning about the lay of the land through Zooms or whatever the form of conversation is. It's more challenging to meet the team, but we say, really regular contact with the team helps take the barriers down, and doing brown bags and virtual happy hours if they're comfortable doing that, where people can be more casual. Having a pet parade, which I understand some of you have done in your Zoom meetings, where you can show who's making all that noise outside your home office. But in general, I think recognizing that our job it's like a heart transplant. When you do a heart transplant, you don't just crack open a chest cavity, take out an old heart and put a new one in. You really have to wire it. There's some surgery involved. And if a heart transplant procedure is 4 or 6 or 8 hours, only the first hour is about really putting the heart in place. The rest is about making sure that it is circulating the way it needs to and that it has the needed electrical impulses. So probably TMI, but I thought it might be helpful.
Well, and Linda, what you're saying leads me to, during heart transplants, there's multiple feedback loops. And those are formalized and put in place. And it made me think of all of our clients who have very structured and formalized areas and ways to provide feedback to clients. So that's another piece of it too.
Well, and I assume we have to wrap up in just a minute, but I want to talk about an example of when feedback made all the difference. We had someone working in a pharma company in a technical role at a high level, and they came in and they really loved the skill set of the people on their team. It's a global, far-flung organization, and this person happened to be based somewhere in the US, but in a multinational company. And this leader was very confident about their team and the skills they had, and talked that team up to anyone who would listen. And finally, when we did a level set for that leader, he found out that someone on his team had made a packaging error in a product that cost the company $1 million, and that his team was sort of persona non grata. But it was months into his transition, and no one told him that. I thought that was tragic, but at least he found out while there was still time to figure out what he had to do with that knowledge. And we just hope that never happens to you.
All right. I think it's about time to wrap up. Want to say another thank you to Linda, Reese, and Stephanie from Leader Onboarding. I'm sure that they'll be available for any other questions. Please connect with them. You have, kind of their handles there for you, and they will, I'm sure, be in hopefully one of the lunch networkings as well. And up next, we have our panel for adopting a customer success discipline to scale. So thank you all, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.